All right, fantastic. Well, first, thanks so much for coming out today. I hope you find this very entertaining and informative, and with all the great options, I appreciate you all coming out and joining us today. So to get started, I want to kind of set some expectations. So first off, this session is for you. I already know this content, so it's not much fun. So if anyone was really hoping I was going to get up here, do a boring lecture, give you some information, and then you would walk away blind looking for the wonderful pretzels, this is not the session for you. If you are really new to business analysis, this may not be the best session for you. We're going to be talking about setting strategic goals, things that contribute to building a capability, ways you might be able to leverage a center of excellence or a community of practice or something like that. So everyone's welcome to attend, but I wanted to set the level that we're really going to try and talk about applied knowledge and what you can really do inside your organization, roughly using what we did at SunTrust as a case study at the same time. That in mind, I want you to interrupt me. We've got lots of extra time. Usually in these sessions, I've only got an hour to work with. We've got up to an hour and a half. So we really want to make this engaging, interactive, because that's where you're going to get the most out. We need to apply this not only to make sure that you know what it is I'm talking about and it makes sense, but how do we apply it to your organization? What are the challenges you're facing? Are some of the guidelines I gave even realistic? And I will say, just so that everyone knows, some of these things we fought for months over. And so I will be very surprised if there isn't pushback or questions here as well. Everyone in the back, please move all the way forward. We have to make room. The choir will be joining us halfway through. The normal disclaimer that I have to do is this content is my content and my content alone. These are my comments, and in no way does SunTrust represent or back up these statements. Also, I can clearly say that no animals were harmed in the creation of this presentation, but I do encourage you to support your local rescue groups. So let's jump right into the end. Let's jump all the way to the conclusions and say, Hans, what are the 5 steps that you're recommending we take to be able to set up a strategic vision in our organization? And when we're looking at this, I'm primarily talking about business analysis because it's something that's near and dear to my heart. It's really where I had the most impact in the team I was working with at SunTrust. But this can be applied to any role, to any area. The fundamentals of organizational change and org change management are very similar. So hopefully you'll be able to take these lessons and apply them to whatever area of your business needs help. The first thing is probably the most important. You've got to find the change agents. These are your thought leaders. These are the people who are willing to put their neck out on a line. They're willing to volunteer. They're willing to help you. They're the people who actually, in a meeting, are coming up with the good ideas. Nobody wants to go out and say, okay, I'm going to go on the street and I'm going to find the 5 worst people and I'm going to assemble a team and set a strategic vision. You want to find the people that really are going to be there and help you make a difference. Does that make sense? Who can automatically think in their organization 3 people that they would call on tomorrow if they had to put together a team to solve any problem? Only a couple hands? Keep thinking. There's 3 people that if you know in your organization you need to go to, you could find it. What if you extended that outside your company, to your professional network, to your family, to your friends, to everyone else you know? Do we get a few more hands? Are there more people you know if you could reach outside your company? Are you reaching outside your company today? Are you trying to recruit those people? Are you trying to pull them into your organization? You should be. Because the good people will be successful wherever you drop them in. You need the right attitude, the right skills, and really look for those skills. Look for those types of people to participate. The first is, you really need to set a destination postcard. And that's where we're going, what really our 2020 vision ended up being is, where do we want to be at the end? You know, a lot of times when you sit down, especially as a business analyst, you say, okay, what are the business features? What are your business needs? What are your goals? What is it you hope to accomplish? Well, sometimes an easier way is to start at the end and say, 10 years from now, if I was having the same presentation in front of you, or I was in the audience and you were telling me, we did this and we were successful, what are the bullets I would see? What would that success look like? And we'll show you what we what we mapped out for our success. Now, this and the next bullet, scripting the critical steps, are actually pulled directly from what I would say the best org change management book written is, and that is Switch, How to Make Change When Change is Difficult by Chip and Dan Heath. If you are going to change your organization, if you are going to influence people, this is the next book you need to read. I cannot recommend it highly enough. They are excellent authors. Their first book, Made to Stick, is wonderful. Why Some Ideas Prevail. Like, everyone here can tell me at least one urban legend they've heard, but I'll bet you money that nobody can recite their corporate motto and their corporate vision statement perfectly. And they'll tell you why in that other book. So I recommend that. But scripting the critical steps really refers to, we can't control everything. You know, the minute you have a plan, that plan is already wrong. It's already outdated. But if you can figure out what are those milestones, what are those significant changes that have to happen to align you to your further goal, your future goal, then everything else will end up lining itself up too, and you have a much greater chance of success. You've then got to create a mechanism for change. Having a great idea, having a vision, knowing what you want to do doesn't get you there. If you're planning, you know, for some of you, maybe you're extending the conference into a family vacation. So you had your destination, but how's the family going to get here? What parks are you going to visit? What order? Where are you going to stay? You've got to start figuring out what are those critical items that need to happen to allow things to progress. And then you've got to align the tools, align the people to make those things happen. Are you going to use something like Kayak to do fare comparison and try and find the best rates? Are you going to go with what's the most convenient? Call up the concierge and say, book everything for me and make it wonderful. All of these are options, but you've got to have some mechanism for making these changes happen. As you move along, that mechanism for change, you've got to have some way of continually assessing, improving, and updating it. A vision should always be just on the horizon. It should always be driving you forward. It's not so much a final destination as a destination that you continually keep trying to go to. So I wanted to take a second and find out, do these 5 steps make sense? And is there anything critical that you'd say, if we were when I talk about organizational change, or if I talk about building out a competency or improving how we deliver projects, are there things that you are used to seeing that are missing here? And what's missing? There's got to be something. There's always something missing. Yes?
I don't know if it's missing because it might be included, but really having a really core set of either a taxonomy or a structure or those guideposts, and maybe that's part of your destination postcard, but that structure that outlines how where your vision is.
Absolutely. So there's 2 good points there. One is, are you trying to build this change, this vision, on a good foundation or a bad foundation? So that's got to be one of your first considerations. If you're building something on bad tools, bad processes, bad talent, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have a much different road. The critical steps are going to be different. And I'll talk about that the first thing we had to do was to try and get on parity with the rest of the industry. Try and just get on par. And so I'll hit that next. The other was, there was a second part that was important on that. Oh, the second part was, a lot of times when you see this, you see a declarative plan. A very distinct, here are the 12 things we will do. Here is how we are going to do it. Here are the groups that are going to be involved. Once you move into declarative mode, you are locking out the change and the ownership. You are now saying this is the only way to be successful, and now people have to fight you or fight the person who's pushing that change to get it in place. So declarative is another one that I was looking for in terms of this. Another thing that you might see that's not here, sponsorship. I mean, how many people here think that change has to happen from the top? What about change has to happen from the bottom? Somewhere in the middle? All of the above? It is. Change is like a good infection. It makes us all stronger if it's done properly. If it's done wrongly, we have big problems. So let me take you back in history a little bit to what led up to this. And in 2007, and this was prior to myself even joining the bank, SunTrust made a strategic commitment to fundamentally change the way we delivered projects. And specifically, I'm going to touch on the areas that affected business analysis for this example. So the first thing they did is they said, delivery managers, focus on delivery. We are going to hire a group of professional development managers that are going to be the HR managers. They're going to do staffing, they're going to do hiring, they're going to manage performance reviews, they're going to deal with grievances. All of that background stuff we're going to take off your plate so you can focus on execution alone. So to do that, we also had to pull BAs out of the work streams, and basically the way we're lined up is we have a line of business. That line of business needs certain applications to function. Those applications are delivered and managed by work streams. So before, each line of business and work stream had their own exclusive staff. So we pulled those roles together into pools, became a matrixed organization, and that way we could move, realign, reallocate people based on shifting needs of the organization. We also went through, or the company went through, because I wasn't there yet, and they revamped all the tasks. They looked at the SDLC and said, you know what's missing from here? Just about anything that the BA is supposed to do except for taking notes in a PM's meeting. So we got rid of the last task and added in all the BA tasks that needed to happen. And then started creating tools and templates and guidance. Started to build the foundation so that people could be successful. We also knew that, like many organizations, we didn't really have BAs. We had production support managers, we had developers, we had project managers, we had help desk people. We had only a few people who were true career BAs and knew what it meant to be a BA. So the first thing we needed to do was to introduce them and really train everyone as to what BAs were. So we decided to hire B2T Training, who brought in their courses, because their courses are aligned to the IIBA's BA body of knowledge. So we said if we're going to train people, we might as well go with what is the leading industry standard right now. So we created a set of 3 base courses. They were slightly tweaked for our environment, so they did customize them for us. And we put all of our BAs through the training. And it was just some of the best training I've ever taken. And then we also implemented a requirements management tool, saying if we're really going to mature as an organization, we need to have some sort of a system, some sort of a consistent way to manage requirements. And in this case, it also allowed us to then move our requirements into our test center and start mapping requirements to test cases to ensure coverage. So this was another big step in maturity, and this was all done as part of a 2010 plan. So they said, we're going to accomplish all this in 3 years. And they accomplished it even faster than that. So that was great. So once we had this, we had our traveling companions, we had our ruby slippers on, we were all excited, and now where do we go? So now we have people that are, let's say we've got it so that everybody is at least an average BA. They, in general, know what tool to use, what processes and templates. Do we just stop there and claim mediocrity and be excited with that? And a few of us challenged that and said, no, we're not willing to accept mediocrity. We're going to step up and we're going to help. So I'm going to jump to what that vision was. So a small group of us had been working to independently try and make changes and continuous improvements. And through a course of events, we just started meeting and working together. So I want us to spend the most time really challenging this, because what we came up with was the only way we're going to get better, the only way we're going to know what changes should be done is if we know where we're going to be. So we created BA 2020, a clear vision of where we'll be in the year 2020. Does it matter that it was a 10-year plan or a 9-year plan? Irrelevant. BA 2020 was just a really cute name, and we thought it was catchy and would have a lot of meaning. So the first one, and I want to really discuss each of these bullets, is we wanted 80% of our staff BAs to become certified in 2 years. How about some feedback or thoughts on that? Yep.
How many?
So our organization at the time had 120 full-time BAs in IT alone. Contractors represented probably another 50 to 100 at times, and close to 300 over the organization. But it really doesn't count because business BAs, some were data analysts, some were marketing analysts, so it was mixed. So our core target audience was, let's call it 100 people. Yes?
What type of BA certification were you pushing? BT certification, IBA certification?
Bingo. I don't care. Okay. Don't care at all. So that was one of the big questions is, well, B2T offers a certification. The IIBA offered a professional certification, which you had to have. I mean, if you could complete the application, you should be awarded the certificate. It's long, but boy, did they check. Now they've got a junior, it's the wrong term, but it's basically a junior or mid-career BA certification that helps. So the idea here was, it doesn't matter what the certification was. It mattered that somebody was taking the time and they had found an authority that was willing to recognize their skills. Is 80% reasonable? Is this even worth spending any time on? Some. I think a lot of BAs like the idea of having a certification because you see that a lot in developers and in job postings it was starting to pop up more, so it'll make them more marketable, but it's work. Not only are you going to have to sit in classes, you're going to have to do all the background work, you're going to have to take the tests. With B2T, you actually develop a full requirements package that's submitted for review based on background data they give. So yeah, it's like doing an extra project on top of your extra projects. So there definitely was some pushback.
Was SunTrust footing the bill for the training?
Yes. And the and certification. Yep.
What was the incentive though? Would you incent them if you don't do this, you lose your job?
Nope. It was a goal, and so with the PDMs, with our professional development managers, there was a push that was listed as a career goal if you were at the stage where you should get certification. So your performance evaluation every year could get dinged if you didn't. I'm one of those people that had got too busy and keep getting dinged every year because I'm only halfway through the application after 4 years, so I just need to sit down for a weekend and get it done. So also keep in mind, these are the long-term goals. This is saying where our organization would be. Anyone think this might be a good idea? Any reasons why? Got a head nod in the middle?
Why the first one's a good idea?
Yeah.
It sets a really clear goal of where you want everybody to be, and it sets a standard across the organization.
Yep. So one of the things that this did, even if we think 80% is attainable, 2 years to get certified at the level, or maybe this isn't, we have to adjust it, but the idea is we're taking this role seriously. The organization values it, and as recognition for that, we want to show all of our partners that we have certified BAs in these lead positions, and they're the ones taking charge. So looking at the next one, this one was a little more challenging. We wanted our BAs to be recognized as a team lead. How many BAs do we have, or people that consider themselves a BA in the room? Okay, good, a little more than half. How many people feel that they are instantly respected when they join a project team and considered one of the core team members and leaders in making that project successful? A few less hands. And maybe it's because the people who are BAs but aren't successful are hiding because of this challenge. We had a huge challenge. The BA was the scribe. The BA was the SharePoint administrator. They were the assembler of the documentation. No, not at all. So one of our first goals was to validate. We wanted to make sure that by the time we got here, everything we were doing was aligning so that the BA was one of the most valued people on the project team. And if you notice, that's probably the only one here that's subjective in the whole list. Everything else, we went with hard, quantifiable, no wiggle room goals. So let's dig into some of these, because this is where we started to have all of our best internal fights. 90% requirements coverage, which means when I do business requirements, when I do system functional, non-functional requirements, I have covered 90% of all possible requirements that can be documented. Yes?
I'm sorry. I thought you were supposed to knock on this.
So, then let's jump back. Absolutely.
So how do you get that recognition, right? Because typically the project manager is seen as the project lead. So now you're wanting to promote the BA to be more respected. But that just doesn't, in an organization, change on having a person at a time.
Absolutely. So in a project, we'll do it by show of hands. Who is the official single point of contact, official lead of a project? Is it the project manager? Is it the BA? It is the project manager. Nobody else on a project is responsible for delivery ultimately other than the project manager. The business analyst is the advocate for the business needs, the business goal. A project manager lives within a project. They pop into existence when the project starts. They mysteriously vanish when the project ends, only to reappear at the next project. The BA is the one who lives and breathes with the business need, the business goals throughout the life cycle. They are the domain representative. They are the spokesperson. They're press secretary for the president. They're out there on the front end making sure that that message is carried through. So in this case, it was more, for that one to be successful, we had to have a culture and an environment where the BAs were performing, people were valuing and realizing that performance, and those BAs were being used and allocated correctly. So by far, that's absolutely one of the hardest things. And it can't be based on individuals. It had to be based on a collective. Having Bob, the wonder BA, over here only means Bob is in high demand. So it's not the BA that's respected, it's Bob. So we needed to have Bob's reputation spread across the organization so that all BAs were respected that way. Any other thoughts or comments on that particular bullet? Yes?
Well, I think the comment here is as a project lead, not as the project
yes.
lead. So you can have multiple people being a lead, and the BA should be the lead in the requirements phase or in the process of eliciting requirements or whatever.
Our project team leads, the PM owns ultimate delivery responsibility. We have a tech lead, a solution architect, there's an enterprise architect who's more for guidance, we have a test lead, and then we have the lead BA. So whoever is the lead, they're responsible for all functions of that role. So my tech lead is responsible for everything the developers produce. They don't have to code it all, but they better make sure that it gets done to their satisfaction. Yep. Yes?
I think that the leads need to respect each other as leads too.
Absolutely.
Because if the other lead doesn't respect the BA, then they're just going to run over them.
Yep, and that's that same dynamic. It's do they not respect the person, or do they not respect the role? We were starting from a foundation where the role wasn't respected at all. So even a really good BA didn't have a chance of success because nobody wanted to let them do their job. So that was the first obstacle. Yes, sir?
Just fundamental to this, you mentioned you had separation of roles.
Yes.
The BA just does the BA work. Is that one of the basis of this?
A little bit. There were times where we wanted to reinforce that. So what we did was, and it was a little controversial, but it's actually worked. There are project roles. There are people. Project roles only do what that role does. There is no exception. A BA will not do anything other than acceptance test validation. They will not write test cases. They will not come up with a test plan. They will not execute integration test cases at all. Bob, the person, may be assigned as a BA lead and may be assigned as the test lead. But then that is Bob performing two separate roles. And we tried to make sure that didn't happen much, but in some cases you just can't help it. But separating the role from the person was critical, and making sure that as the person was talking about what role they were playing, they made sure there was a clear distinction, because BAs get dumped on for testing. It's that training or help documentation, whatever's needed. But testing was one of the first ones. We have a dedicated enterprise testing organization that's actually pretty mature. So shifting and making sure that they got the work allowed them to build reusable test cases, allowed them to build out their test suite so that every time we have a system change or upgrade, we didn't have to do manual testing. And when you're talking about a highly regulated industry with only 4 releases a year where I can touch a key financial application, if I upgrade a server, I have to test it all the way back to the GL. You don't want to do that manually. You want to automate as much as possible. So that's what we had to build out to. So pulling those roles and separation in the SDLC, in communication, and supporting it throughout the organization with training, with reminders, anything we could. Our Center of Excellence were the advocates pushing for that continually. Anything else on that one? Okay, so jumping back to 90% requirements coverage. Does anybody think that that's reasonable? That one's a little tougher. Part of it is going to be based on I would say, some sort of a assessment of the scope to do requirements, mapping out, and then marking what's in and out of scope. Yes?
So you're tracking changes. You're tracking the churn of the requirements throughout the project, and then comparing back to...
That's where we wanted to get to the point where we could do that, yes.
And I'm assuming you're talking waterfall world here, right? Or did
primarily
it matter?
Primarily waterfall, but you could do it in any environment. So part of it is, if you're talking about Agile, then maybe you're talking about 90% coverage of what needs to be for a sprint. And an easy way of looking at it is, am I really going to document all of my error codes and error handling and error messages? If I've got to cut something, that's usually the first to go. Especially if I'm doing a system upgrade or a migration, I'll usually skip those. So I'll say, okay, error messaging ends up being what I think would amount to, let's call it 100 requirements. So how does that 100 requirements map against the larger number I'm going to produce? So the other thing we needed to do, and you'll notice here are percentages, is we had to have a way of scaling requirements. If we said no more than 10 missed requirements, 10 missed requirements out of 10,000, which is what some of our projects have, is no big deal. I mean, that's a dream. 10 out of 100 is a 10% failure rate. You know, NASA would never let anything launch with anything close to that. So part of it is we're starting to get into really the meat of this is, wow, how am I going to test this? How am I going to measure this? You know, what does coverage mean? And so part of that is, that's one of the struggles. That's one of the things we have to push towards. And for 90% coverage, really, we felt that that was reasonable for the scope of the project. That each project, if they could hit 90% of what they really should do to achieve the scope of work as it's laid out in the charter, we're probably in good shape. Because then we can build on that every time, and that overall percentage will end up shrinking. Yes?
Okay, so when you say requirements, you are talking business and functional?
Absolutely. And that would be an option. Do you want to measure them together or separately? I like measuring them separately because I should have traceability between the two. So I should have at least 2 to 1, sometimes 10 or 20 to 1 system requirements to business requirements.
And is the BA writing the functional and the business requirements?
Yes, absolutely. So they'll write the business and system, and then our functional, we break down functional and non-functional. And we actually rolled out standard non-functionals to make it even easier. We have packages of pre-written non-functional requirements that the owner of those NFRs actually goes through, sits down with the project and says, these apply, these don't. You check them off and load them to the repository. And then you always have variable NFRs, things like, what are my volume? What is my data? What is my number of users? What are concurrent sessions? So we actually scripted out meetings and help guides so that people could answer those questions. So we said, okay, what's my recovery time objective? Well, we support 3 standard recovery time objectives. Here's what they are. Here's the questions to ask to determine which one would apply. And then the architects have to figure out how to hit them. You don't say, you don't ever write a requirement that says this needs to be a high availability system. No, because that's awful. And when you get audited, it's horrible. You need to say, how fast does that system come back online? They may make the conclusion that from an infrastructure standpoint, this is now classified as high availability. And guess what? High availability means plus or minus 4 hours. So there's no such thing as completely 100% always on systems. There is. You just can't afford it. Yes?
So, milestone-wise, 10% difference in requirements coverage. So you're allowing 10% change and still meeting your deadlines and your goals along the way?
Not 10% change. In this one, 10% coverage missing. So what we're saying is we agree to move forward as a project with the understanding that we are not documenting everything that could be documented, but we will exceed 90% of what needs to be documented to move forward.
But there's a possibility of 10%. There could be 10% change.
Yeah, and so that's where we're going to hit the next 3 bullets, is where we get into where the change and the churn. Because one of the first things we had was our testing organization said, hey, we're going to start measuring requirements volatility. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the number of requirements you've loaded into the system each week. We're going to look at the number of ones that were added, updated, deleted, and then we're going to come up with a churn percent. These weren't finalized requirements. So every week I would have my requirement sessions. I'd load in another couple thousand. And the first week I load 2,000. Next week I load 2,000. I now have 100% variance. I load 2,000 the next week. I'm now down to 50% variance. That's bunk. That just doesn't work. That's a bad way of measuring. So there has to be another. Yes.
Sorry.
Yep.
Just trying to understand what you mean by requirements for coverage. Are you saying that you're actually not going to iterate in detail what the full requirements are? You're only going to capture. Elaborate on 90% of it.
Sure. So if I said that I was going to find out the name, last 3 jobs, and contact information for everybody in this room, 90% requirements coverage would mean I can only miss partial data on 5 people, or 5 pieces of data on people. If I decide to measure each individual point of data as a requirement, then it gives me a larger pool, and I can miss more information. So if I go by and somebody is changing cell phones, or their cell phone is no longer accurate, or I don't capture it because somebody runs out to the bathroom and I miss them, one person leaving the room could cause my coverage variance. But it's saying that we're agreeing as a company that if we can get up to 90% coverage, and here's why. Where we're starting from, we have requirements that said system will match current functionality except, and then list out the changes. That was 2% coverage, only covering what changed. But we didn't have a baseline. If you don't have baseline requirements and you're just documenting changes, how do you know what you're supposed to do? When we revamped our online banking, I documented close to 90 different screens that we were going to have to migrate over. Did the requirements and thought we had 100% coverage. Then we discovered that the screens were variable depending on which accounts were in our test profile, and there's actually close to 160. So I missed, 40% of the screens just by a test error. So we had to go through and say, okay, in this timeline, I can't capture everything. What am I willing to capture? Error messaging, we're not going to address. Certain back-end processing, we're not going to address because it's not changing. So we agreed to a certain gap and said we're moving forward without that gap.
So the rest is pushed off to future cycles?
Absolutely, or deemed not a business value. So for example, documenting color and layout and design or certain base use cases like authentication may not matter in your application. They're locked down in their standard. You may agree that you're just not going to cover them. It's going to be as is. And that's okay. Yes?
If you're evaluating misses, like one requirement miss may be a heck of a lot more
I do, and we should, but we're not at that level of maturity. So we're starting to get to the point where people are realizing how costly misses and requirements are. Another presentation I give is on requirements change management, how to use a hospital triage method and PM change controls, but applied to requirements. And just touching on that, in a waterfall environment, if you catch a requirement, if you miss a requirement, it will cost you 100 times as much when you find it in production. If you're in iterative, it costs you 50 times as much. If you're in agile, it still costs you $25 times as much. So if it would have cost me $1,000 to document a requirement, even in agile, I'm looking at $25,000 to fix that in production. That is a huge cost and a huge reason to push a lot of the analysis work and validate up front. So we also wanted to have less than 5% missed requirements at sign-off. So we've agreed to a certain scope of requirement, and then we discover that we missed things or things were needed. So we wanted to make sure that at each sign-off stage, you had 95% coverage of everything that had to be documented. What about that number? High, low? So we're saying we're only covering 90% of what needs to be done, and now we're saying on top of that, of what you expected to have done, you only can miss about another 5%. Yes?
Question. Are we dependent on the user community for the requirements? And if they don't think about things, you can't sort of read their mind.
True. So the BA is the facilitator. They're the ones who are going to draw out the requirements. And there is a heavy team dependency. But at the end of the day, there's only one person who's accountable for requirements, and that's the BA. And if they aren't getting what they need, then the project needs to take that into account. You need to extend deadlines. You need to revisit what your scope and release is. Because what happens when you move forward and say, well, it's not really my fault because that team was busy on a production issue and they didn't give me my requirements, so we're moving on without it. Okay, yeah, it's like starting your family's trip with one flat tire. Yeah, you get out of the driveway, but how far are you going to get? Yes?
Where do you count for the other 5%? If you got 90% coverage and less than 5% missing?
So part of this was taking a look at kind of our maturity level and saying, where are we and what's reasonable? And that's why, this is why I think we will spend more time on this slide than anything else, and we should. Because there's no wiggle room in these. If we set this as our strategic vision and then start putting in plans to make this happen, training people to know what to expect, putting in measures, you can't get out of that number. So why 5%? Why not?
Well, if you've hit 4, you've hit 3. I mean, are 4 and 3 measuring the same thing, just differently?
No, they're measuring two different things.
Okay. So what's the difference between what those two are saying? So
the other is, let's say I sign off on a business requirement specification and it has 500 requirements. During system requirements, if I discover more than 25 new business requirements, I failed this measure. So it will be the delta or the number of change requirements that were change controlled back into the project. And this is also at sign-off. So if I could have any number of reviews, but at some point I draw a line in the sand and I say, this is it. These are the requirements for this area. If I go back and add requirements, I am now creating that magnified cost. I'm creating 2 times the cost at a minimum to now catch them in the next level of requirements. So that's why that pushes there. We also know a lot of times your business requirements, you end up discovering them when you do the system requirements. You end up finding out new business requirements when you run into design constraints.
So in 3, do you draw that line for number 3 at production release?
Yes. Okay. Yes. So the final so I would say at the final package at the close of the project, did you have 90% coverage of everything that needed to be done? Yes. That's how I would implement it. Yes?
How do you determine the granularity of that requirement? It could be just like a text box, or it could be an entire use case.
That is the biggest challenge ever, and I've got it on additional slides. How do you measure? Because how you measure, it's just like an incentive program. Depending on how you incent people, dramatically changes their behavior. And so knowing how to measure, like if I look at this and I could say, okay, I typically write long narrative requirements, but if I break them out and decompose them from 1 to 10, I now have a larger body of requirements, therefore my variance is smaller. Okay, is that a behavior that we want to enforce? Actually, yes it is. Because the further you decompose the requirements, you are reducing risk. You are making things more, removing ambiguity. You are following smart guidelines much more. So by breaking that out, use cases, do you just count use cases? You could. You could break out parts of use cases and test that. You could have some sort of criteria. So really it depends on what your organization can sustain, because measurement costs money. So you've got to get a return. So, things like diagrams and flow charts. Do I count each wrong box or do I count each wrong flow chart? Don't know. Haven't gotten that far yet. We haven't gotten to that level of maturity. If we can capture, most of our projects are driven off of testable narrative requirements that are then tied to test cases. That's just how we're set up at the moment. So right now, that's going to be probably 90% or more of my measurement is off what we can capture. Yes, ma'am?
So how do your BAs feel about that, saying that, you can only have less than 5% of this requirement at sign-off? Because part of that, just like someone said, is we're not all mind readers with our business. And from my business users, I can elicit as much as I can up front, and then they get a bright idea 3 months later. And it's like, oh, Felicia, can we do this? And
Yep.
oh, we've got to have this. And, they'll put the big push behind it.
Yep.
But, am I getting penalized because, my business user got a bright idea in the middle of the night?
Now, let me flip that back. Answer your own question. You're a BA. You have completed requirements for a body of work that's now in development. I come to you with a new idea that I want to introduce to the project. What do?
Well, I'm going to tell you that it's going to be a cost to the project. It's going to cost you money to do this, and it's going to extend the timeline possibly. And is it worth the time and the cost to implement this?
You change control. It's a change control. It's requirements change management. One of the fundamental sections in the BABAC. So what happens if you add requirements to the project? You are changing the scope of the requirements. Therefore, you are increasing the number of requirements. Therefore, it wasn't missed. It's new. We're talking about stuff where the BA just flat out missed recording, missed communicating. So yes, in a tough organization, your requirements change control could be the only thing that saves you from these metrics, and making sure that only the approved scope was part of those packages, and anything else gets change controlled in. And a great example of that is a company that I'm aware of has a 95% on time, on budget project rating. Can anyone else, by show of hands, claim that their company has the same thing? 95% of all projects are on time and all budget, on budget. What that really means is only 5% of the project managers at that company were not intelligent enough to issue a final change control, resetting the schedule, the cost, the budget at the very end of the project to match what they had just delivered. And their governance process allowed them to do that. So it's kind of the same thing. The change control could be your ally. It's your shield. It's your armor. It's what protects you from scope creep. It's what defines, it's what forces people to participate. Because you can de-scope items just as well. These stakeholders are not participating, so we're going to have to de-scope or defer those items now. So once we have the requirements and they're signed off, we actually use our testing organization to perform static testing on the requirements. Anyone familiar with static testing? So basically what static testing is, it is Test cases against your requirements. Are there any ambiguities? Did you properly decompose? Are the requirements specific, measurable, actionable? What are the others? Relative, time-based. So we measured and had to come to an agreement that the requirements were smart and there were no ambiguities. So our team would actually log defects against the requirements, and then the BA would have to respond. Is it a clarification or a rewrite to make the requirement better? And if so, that's not a defect. That is viewed as, yes, we'll make the change, but we get a free pass. If it is wrong, if there was an error, if it was incorrect, that is a defect. It is a valid defect and accounted against the requirements. If there's an omission that they find that was within scope, that is a defect. If the tester was wrong, they didn't understand the difference between a functional and non-functional requirement, and they logged a defect, we rejected and it didn't count against them. So we wanted to make sure that we had a criteria to judge them against, and that there was a process to agree to whether or not that defect was valid. We also then said, okay, we can't, when you talk about unit testing and integration testing, the BA is irrelevant. Your requirements should not have any bearing to defects found in those test environments, because your requirements should have been translated to the design. You then use unit and integration testing to validate that your design was done properly. And it's not until acceptance testing where you're looking to see, are the functions, are the use cases, are the user stories, are the conditions, are the error handling, is all that stuff that I wanted in place working? And so what we wanted to do is we found it was very reasonable to only find less than 2% valid UAT defects due to requirements. That means that the requirement was wrong, or there was an omission which caused something in acceptance testing to fail. Now again, to the earlier point, failure because somebody thought of something new, or suddenly you know, especially in Agile, the idea is to make lots of mistakes, put something out there and see what happens. That's okay. You need to take that into account in your culture. So you want to encourage positive failure. You want to reduce avoidable failure. Yes?
So how would you know if it was a missing requirement? How would you know that it failed at acceptance testing?
So I would have to look at my traceability and find out if I had a failed user acceptance test. A user tried to perform a function, and that function was critical and required and within scope, and I can't trace it back to a system, or maybe it's a missing system requirement usually at that level. It shouldn't be a missing business requirement. If you're missing business requirements in user acceptance testing, extend your test cycles by 4. You've got serious problems. So really it would be, most of the time is, the business function, a business requirement tells us what it was I was trying to do. Is the user able to complete that function? If not, where are the system requirements that would tell me how that function would have been completed? And so that's where that would show up. So really at that level, at the UAT level, you're almost purely looking at system level requirements, both functional and non-functional. Non-functional, again, are a lot harder to test. If you end up doing performance load testing and the system crashes, and you find out that your user estimates were completely wrong, or your data volumes were completely wrong, then you have to decide. If the information you gave was approved and reliable, it doesn't count against you. It wasn't your fault that you accurately communicated the wrong information. That's called a rumor. We try and avoid rumors, but they happen anyway. Okay? So the other area was, we knew that as an organization, we needed to provide an infrastructure, a support mechanism for people to be successful. So that it didn't matter if you were a contractor coming into the environment on their first day and expected to have a requirements package by the end of the week, whether you were a junior BA hired, whether you were the most senior person in the company. We wanted to have job aids, knowledge base, and templates covering only 75% of all BA activities. Why 75%? Let's shoot that number down too. Why wouldn't we want 100% coverage on all BA activities?
Some of them are kind of nebulous.
Okay, some you might not be able to script. You may not be able to support. Yes?
80% of your problems are, it's like Pareto chart, right? 80% is really, really good. You're going to cover the vast majority of activities that you do if you document 75%.
Yeah, so using that logic, 80% would have been a better number. Then I can quote the 80-20 rule. 80% of my value comes from just 20% of my work. What are some others? Let's shout out a couple other reasons. Why only 75%?
You're going to do one-off things once in a while.
Absolutely. You can't predict everything. So why would I script something that's only going to happen infrequently? It's just too expensive. What else? This side of the room, the quiet side. The deeply thoughtful side. I need one good reason or we don't move forward. Okay. I need one good thought of why we wouldn't want 100% coverage or challenging saying we think we could get more. If we became too prescriptive, we would scare away all the good people. The better the people you have, the less process and structure you need to have in place. The more process and structure you have in place, the more you scare away good people because they don't want to do things the way you tell them to do. Absolutely. So we'll give everyone here a slide for that. So the last one basically says, and by the way, we have to have a way of knowing that all the other stuff ended up being true. We got more pushback and more challenge by naysayers saying, fine, we'll agree with the numbers, we'll agree with the goals. If you can achieve this, we will be a benchmark company when it comes to business analysis. But we don't believe you can measure it. We don't think you can do it, so let's scrap the whole thing. And we fought really hard against that, and the setting the baseline, setting the measurements, trying to agree to it is obscenely difficult. Switching methodologies, switching from narrative requirements to use case driven can radically change these things. It's a lot of work. It's really hard. That's the other reason we gave ourselves a decade. We figured we might have a shot at it in 10 years. Any final thoughts on this, and then we'll kind of move on to a few other slides? Yes, sir.
So you haven't actually implemented this yet. It's still in the process.
It will always be in process. This is active, live, and these are the benchmarks that we are performing against. And I'm going to show you how we're doing it next, because you're right. One of the things is we have to have a mechanism for change. So we created at the company a way of looking where we said everything we do, we should pretend that the client is in the middle of the table, in the center of the room, and we need to do what's best for the client. Well, who's our client? Our client is the BA. And what BA is more well-known, more popular, more powerful than BA BHAGS? Or Mr. T, for those that aren't quite as old and gray as I might be. So we had to ask ourselves, what is it that a BA needs to be successful? How is the BA going to recognize that what they're doing is the right thing? How do they know if they're successful? How will we make sure that other people engage a BA properly? How do we know that the stakeholders and the SMEs and the SLT are using BAs appropriately? And for us, it came down to 3 key elements that we needed to support. Every change control we did had to support at least one of the following. It had to improve skills. It had to improve the tools. And tools isn't just software tools, it's anything. Anything that somebody uses to be more successful is a tool. Communication skills are your tool. And they had to have the authority. And that authority, that last piece, is one that can't be mandated. It has to be earned. It is the equivalent of earning respect. And it is going to be the hardest thing. We have it in some areas, we don't have it in others. I have a project team who went into the most hostile environment, and 9 months later, the sponsoring team can't live without them. They have transferred the bulk of the work over to our team. The trust is there, but it took 9 months to build the authority to make changes. So for us, where does the support for these changes come from? Really, and I tried to break this out more general so it would apply. One is, somewhere in your organization, people control the role. They control the people that are in that role, and you've got to have their support and buy-in. They've got to be willing to back you and say that they are going to support this quality improvement. The other is, for us, was the PMO. Because out of the PMO, that's where the processes, the methodology, the templates, the governance, the accountability models came from. So the combination of both ended up feeding into our Center of Excellence. And our Center of Excellence is official, it's charted, we have, I think we're at 18 official members, 8 core people, and then 10 workstream BAs we've added. And it started off as just 3 people getting on a call once a week to coordinate changes. So it doesn't have to be group. It can be all volunteer. It can be informal. It's just if you have the right change agents, they will be successful. So one thing as you're looking in your roles, if you're saying, I'm setting a strategic vision, who are the people, who are those key stakeholders that own a piece of what that vision is going to mean, or who that vision is going to apply to? It won't apply them directly, but it impacts them indirectly. So you've really got to make sure you've got the right group. Our chartering of our CEO, the battle between the two, we actually had 2 separate groups. The battle between these groups lasted for 6 months, where we couldn't charter over arguing who was going to control, whether it would be shared control. And if you're interested in that, ping me later, because I've got a whole separate presentation on how to get a COE formed in a hostile environment that goes into greater depth. But for the background for this, you have to understand who your stakeholders are. So when we were looking at making changes, we needed a discrete way of eliminating personal bias. Like if you come from organizations where whoever has the money gets to pick what projects are done, it can be a real frustrating environment to work in. We didn't want our group, our changes to become a political tool. So we created 5 criteria that we judged all requests by. Whether we created the requests, whether they came from other teams, we logged them on a task list, prioritized them based on how well they qualified against these 5 tasks. And the first is, at the end of the implementation, whatever change we put in, because change always has a negative impact on people. It's always stressful, so we wanted to make sure changes had to make the BA faster, easier, and more accurate. All 3. And that's kind of a stretch. You think, well, what if it didn't make the BA faster? Then we don't need to do it. What if it's not improving accuracy? We need to make sure that all of our tasks, the end goals were phrased so that all 3 of these were true. We also want to make sure that anything we want, any change we picked needed to be implemented in less than 3 months duration, less than 160 work hours. So why is that? For us, that's because that was the size of our team. That was the capacity on a all-volunteer group. That was the bandwidth where we felt if it lasted longer than 3 months or took more than those hours, it was too big of a change for us to implement. It either needed to be funded as a project or broken down into smaller tasks that we could implement. So it forced us to make difficult choices, and break out those changes into the core value. So maybe you don't get the whole buffet, maybe you just pick 5 dishes and go with that. But so it forced us to make some difficult decisions. But in the end, we knew we'd be more successful and we'd be able to roll things out. And we were able to roll out changes on a monthly basis. And I've got the process here as well. It had to have measurable value. If we couldn't measure the value somehow, even subjectively, we weren't going to do it. And we were trying to get away from the old adage that I know this is the right thing to do, so we're going to do it, and that's really where that came in. The last is it had to enforce our governance, compliance, and other standards. Now, a change to compliance, governance, and other standards counts, because then there's a process for getting those changed, in which case we're still participating. But what it meant is we're regulated. We have a framework we have to operate under, so our changes have to fit into it. Any thoughts on the task criteria?
This is the task for the Center of Excellence.
Yes, so these are the discrete individual changes. Examples of changes were the creation of an NFR template, the rewrite of our requirements templates, the rewrite of our use case model templates, a best practices guide for Agile, phase gate requirements for what the BA was responsible for, and the RACI for all document approvers. These were all things that we sponsored through the COE. Also, vendor requirements. That one we had to break down several times. How do you do requirements when you're doing a third-party integration? Do you document all of the current state functionality that the app has? Well, the testers say they need it to be able to test, but you bought a software package that's already been tested. Or do you just test the configurations? Or do you just write use cases and scenarios? So we had to come up with standards and guidelines, and it ended up breaking out into, I think they ended up breaking out into 4 different type of COTS integration that we did, and each had slightly different variances on what would be produced. So that was one that had to be broken out. Yes?
So is this an example of you switching the critical moves without being declarative?
Yes, absolutely. Yep. So these give us our guardrails and say, if we can stay in these guardrails, we think we have a good chance of being successful, and that we're only implementing positive changes. And part of that is we came from an organization where anytime a process broke, the BA was blamed, the BA was thrown at the problem. For example, we had systems going in without monitoring set up, because by the time the monitoring group got referenced, it was too late, so they'd go live and then add it in later. So what's the solution? It's the BA's fault, and the BA is now responsible for writing monitoring requirements prior to there being a scope of work. Come on, people. I mean, there's a time and a place, so helping get those sequences fixed was very important as well. Yes?
Measurable value. I have a question about that. Is there a point or cutoff point where, okay, there's some value, but not enough? I mean, what's acceptable? Measurable is fine, but what about acceptable?
So there's 2 aspects, and the first aspect is each change was discussed, decomposed, and the requirements written up by the team or the sponsor, and then evaluated and rated by the team on a weekly basis. So we rated and re-ranked. The second was, and I'll show you the process flow for how these changes worked, each one had to have a sponsor, and so it had to have somebody willing to champion that change, and that more than anything else really made sure that if I have a list, I think last I looked at the list, there were 45 items on it. I might be able to tackle 2 to 3 at a time. I'm packing the ones that are going to make me look the best or have the best impact. We wanted the high visibility, the high value ones. So when we're executing this vision, when we're making the change, the other thing we had to know is, what are we making this change against? And there were really 2 aspects. One was, we needed to know that we were changing people, we were changing roles, we were impacting individuals. So this was, any change was going to impact the group making the change. It was going to affect all the development managers, the PMO, the business analysts themselves, and anybody the BA came in contact with could be impacted. Well, what other impacts do we have? Well, we know that process and tools. So we were changing the SDLC, we were changing templates, we were changing training. And so we had to realize and quantify, this change is going to impact these groups, and that became our org change management plan. But then it let us implement that change. On several of these things, we did webinars and road shows to not only the group that